Hello and welcome to our April Lunchbox lecture at the National D-Day Memorial. My name is John Long. I'm the Director of Education. It's my pleasure to welcome you here for what proves to be a very interesting talk about a subject that I think will capture a lot of attention, because this is the kind of thing that a lot of World War II buffs are very enthusiastic when they see one of these great artifacts. And you may never have thought of these bomber jackets as works of art, but fortunately, we have an author with us today who's going to explain that to us. So it's my pleasure to give an introduction to John Slemp, who had a 30-year career in advertising and photography, spent 11 years in the U.S. Army before he attended the Portfolio Center in Atlanta, and was trained as a photographer, and through his career has captured on film or digitally Oscar winners, Olympic champions, astronauts, musicians, artists, pilots, and veterans, especially in context of what we're talking about today. And read some of his past clients and see if you can see a connection here between the ones he's highlighting. Some of his past clients include the Aircraft Owners and Pilots Association, EPS Aviation, Goodyear Aviation, EAA Sports Aviation Magazine, General Aviation News, the Smithsonian Air and Space Magazine, Jet Support Services International, Avfuel, the Lindbergh Foundation, and Women in Aviation International. So you can probably guess from this, this is a man with a great appreciation of aviation and pilots, and that's going to show up in the work that we're going to be discussing today. Most relevant to our discussion, our lecture now, is his most recent book titled Bomber Boys, World War II Flight Jacket Art. And so let's bring John in. And John, welcome to our Lunchbox lecture. And I'll take a minute
John.
Before we turn it over to you to introduce you to Marshall Johnson, who was, this is Marshall Johnson. He was a bomber pilot from Milwaukee, as you know how well you can see on your screen, the art on this one. But he flew many missions, at least 30 are recorded here. We have his logbook, so we know there are actually some afterwards. And again, I know it's too small to read on screen, but the final one listed was D-Day itself. So this is the only A2 flight jacket we have in our collection. And if I can turn it without knocking it over, I'll show the art on the back. His plane was titled El Flaco, and I bet had a few stories about fighting through his way through El Flaco. But I will happy to show that off, because I think it's one of the coolest things we have in our collection. But let me turn it over to you now to tell us more about your book and about this really fascinating topic.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it here. Let me, so in 2014, I asked around a group I belong to, is the Experimental Aircraft Association. And there's a chapter in Lawrenceville, just outside of Atlanta here. And I asked around if anybody had a jacket. I had known about them for years, but I had never seen one. And sure enough, somebody had one, and they brought it in, and I photographed it, and it was spectacular. And actually, it's the first one here. Let me just go ahead and jump into my presentation here, and we'll do it that way. So, as you mentioned, the title of the book is Bomber Boys, World War II Flight Jacket Art. And to make a long story short, after I photographed that jacket, I sent it to a curator that I know at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, who I had met through one of my clients, Women in Aviation International. Her name is Dorothy Cochran. And 58 minutes later, I got a separate email from their curator of the aviation clothing collection. And he said, "We have 15 jackets that'll work for your project. When can you be here?" Obviously, I was shocked and stunned, elated, etc. And we wound up photographing over 160 jackets across the country and in 12 different museums. including the Air and Space Museum, the Smithsonian in D.C., the 390th Memorial Museum in Tucson, Arizona, the March Field Museum in Riverside, California, 475th Fighter Group at the Plains of Fame Museum in Chino, California, San Diego Air and Space Museum, Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul, the Indiana Military Museum in Vincennes, Indiana, the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, Allen Airways Museum in El Cajon, California, the Air Zoo Aerospace and Science Museum in Kalamazoo, Michigan, the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, and the Lowndes County Historical Society here in South Georgia in Valdosta. And it, besides the museums, we also photographed, I believe, over 40 privately owned jackets, mostly by families. And they proved to be quite a rich ground to mine, so to speak. So this was the first jacket. This belonged to Staff Sergeant A.B. Clement. He was a B-24 top turret gunner in the Mediterranean Theater. And those are bombs. The yellow symbols are bombs. They're not fish, as one person mistakenly assumed. And once I got her straightened out, she understood entirely that this was a record of the man's missions. And what really got me after I photographed this jacket was the grime in the collar. That really brought it alive to me. You know, when you're a kid and you're in history class and you talk about the Battle of Hastings in 1066, well, it sounds like it's very far away and a long time ago, and it's an abstract thing. This was not abstract to me. This was a real man who wore this jacket and served his country. And by the way, I should mention these were photographed with very high resolution cameras, which is why you can see the detail so clearly. This was the back of the jacket, and you know, and I assumed early on that there were probably going to be a lot of how shall we say, scantily clad females on these jackets, but in actuality, of all of them that I shot, I think only 2 or 3 had what might be considered risque artwork. This is pretty tame by today's standards, but as you can tell, the guys back then, even then, had a fine appreciation of the female form. And it's kind of funny, but some of the non-aviators that I've shown this to couldn't quite put missing you together, and I had to explain it to them. But once it became clear, they got it. This is another jacket. This was owned by a fellow in the 100th Bomb Group, and this actually was his second jacket. He had worn out basically his first jacket, and this jacket belonged to a friend of his who was killed in action, and he had it painted up. Obviously, 8th Air Force member, and the Century Bombers was the nickname of the 100th Bomb Group, which, if you know anything about them, they sustained quite a few casualties early on in the war and were considered a hard luck group. In actuality, they probably suffered no more than any other bomb group, but that was their reputation early on. And initially, I was just interested in the artwork and the designs and that sort of thing, and it just went from there. This is an interesting story here. So Walter Thomason is the pilot, left kneeling there, and Wallace Limburn was his flight engineer and top turret gunner on the left there on the top row. And I photographed Walter's jacket here in Atlanta. His son lives in Dunwoody, and he brought the jacket to me, and I photographed it in 2015, right before I went to the annual air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which is called Air Venture. And I put the picture on my iPad, not really thinking too much about it at the time, and went to Oshkosh a couple of weeks later. And while I was there, I ran into a fellow named Limburn, Tom Limburn, his son, Wallace's son. And I didn't make this connection. Initially, I started telling him about what I was doing. And he said, "Oh, my dad was a bomber crewman." And he said, "Walter Thomason was the pilot." I was stunned. And without saying a word, I took out my iPad, showed him the picture. This is Walter's jacket on the left. I said, "This Walter Thomason?" And we had goosebumps for 5 minutes talking about it. And And Tom brought his dad's jacket the following year to Oshkosh, and I photographed it. And that's it on the right-hand side. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would have two jackets from the same crew. But there's no doubt in my mind it's the same artist. I don't know why the Uncle Tom's Cabin is red in red letters on the right, but again, having looked at this artwork pretty closely, and even comparing it to an original picture, which I'll show you next, there's no doubt in my mind it was the same artist. And I'll point out too, the red waistband surprised me, and come to find out there's 18 different manufacturers of these jackets across the country. Most of the manufacturers were in the Northeast, New York, New Jersey area, because that's where the bulk of the garment industry was at the time. And what happened at the time, the Army procured all the raw materials, the leather, the liners, the zippers, the cuffs and waistband material, the snaps, everything, and they gave it to the manufacturers and said, build us a jacket. And so along with a diagram, they would create a jacket for about $8.25. And so this is the photograph that I found in the National Archives and I think this is Tom's jacket. Again, I compared it very closely, and there's no doubt in my mind it's the same. The artwork is virtually identical. But I don't know why the Army photographed these jackets. But if you go and look online, especially, and just Google World War II jackets, you'll find period photographs like this that are official Army images. And you see the AC number down in the lower right. I did a search in the National Archives and sent them that number, and lo and behold, they had a digital file. So it's still out there and still can be found to this day. So besides the jacket, he also brought these, and these are called bomb tags. And I had never seen them before, but essentially that's a cotter pin on the end of the string. And they went into a small propeller that was on the bomb as a safety. And once it was removed and the bomb was dropped from the aircraft, the propeller spun around a certain number of revolutions and it armed the bomb. Well, his dad, Walter, pulled out one of these before each mission and wrote on there the mission number, the date, and the target and the bomb load. And as you can see, for instance, number 32 there, September 26th, 44, Osnabrück, 5 1000 GP bombs, general purpose bombs. And let me go back there. I can't remember if, he did participate. Let's see. No, I'm sorry. He started his missions on the 12th of June in 44. So 6 days after D-Day. But he started in the 12th of June and he finished on September 28th. So at the time, this was, right in the hot and heavy mission flow of the war for the 8th Air Force, especially. These guys could finish their missions virtually in months and be rotated out back to the States. So that's one of the reasons early on there was no mission quota at all. And the casualty rates were 70%, very high. And of course, the soldiers started realizing that there was no way out, essentially, other than being killed or wounded or captured. And the flight surgeons started noticing an increase in sick call rates. I stubbed my toe, I've got a cold today, a tummy ache, etc., and I don't really want to go get shot at today. And they made a recommendation to the commanders to put a mission quota, and that's where 25 came in. And then it increased to 30 and eventually 35. That's one of the reasons why the Memphis Belle was such a big deal. Although they weren't the first to actually reach 25 missions, they were one of the first, and they were selected to come back to the States and go on a national war bond tour to raise money for the war effort. And so that's why they became famous. But this apparently, I come to find out later on, this was not a unique way to record missions. Apparently other guys did it, but this was a new one on me, so to speak. And you've seen pictures of the bombs underneath the aircraft coming out in a staggered form. And immediately when I saw these, I got this picture on the right in my head. And it took me a year, but his son finally relented and let me have the tags again. And I created this picture here. And in an exhibition, it was printed about 6 feet high and about 18 inches across. And you can just walk right up and read each tag clearly. And I thought it was an appropriate way to display those. So here's a jacket that was sent to me from Oakland, California. The son actually, this is Lieutenant Ernest Anders Erickson, and his son actually did quite a bit of research on his dad's time in the service and later on for that matter. And but this is the only record that I could find of how the colors were supposed to look on the unit insignia. I did some homework, and you know, nowadays these being a commercial artist, I'm familiar with what's called PMS colors, Pantone matching system. Pantone has created a system that defines what red is supposed to look like, or blue or yellow, and so on. And that's used extensively in industry, as you might imagine. Coca-Cola, for instance, is very particular about what Coke Red should look like. But at the time, from what I could tell, there was no real standardization as to what the colors should appear to be in an insignia. I contacted the Air Force Archives and so on, and they really didn't have any records in that regard. So I found this drawing that his dad did very interesting. And as you can see, the cross was supposed to be white, but in actuality, it's yellow. And I don't know if that's because they didn't have any white paint, or if the white paint they had faded over time. Just don't know. And the background looks sort of green. It was actually supposed to be dark blue. But there you have it. But this was a really lovely jacket. And here's the inside. And his son is a fine art painter. He and his wife both, and they just loved the pictures. And I was thrilled to have their participation. And so his dad, I believe, did fly on D-Day, if I recall correctly. And they took their aircraft over via Greenland and Iceland to England. And while they were in Iceland, they attended a USO show where Marlene Dietrich sang the song Lily Marlene. And this was actually a German poem, I believe, penned during the First World War, that was set to music in 1937, if I remember correctly. And it became quite popular on both sides. And as you can see, he wrote the D-Day date down at the bottom. But, you know, the families especially had little artifacts like this that really helped tell the story. And here's his dad's wearing that jacket with General Jimmy Doolittle on the ramp somewhere in England. And, you know, I tell people it almost felt like I was touching history in a way when I, you know, handle these jackets. I didn't handle all of them. The ones at the Smithsonian, for instance, they had curators and wearing gloves and that sort of thing, which is the proper way to handle them. And I didn't touch those at all. And, you know, and it's just an artifact to me. I didn't really get any big jollies one way or another handling the jackets, but it was really interesting to make that connection, if you will. His dad stayed or actually became an aeronautical engineer later on, and worked with Kelly Johnson at the Skunk Works, creating the SR-71 and the F-117 and the C-5 and so on. Here's another jacket that I had wanted to photograph for a long time. In 2015, I contacted the U.S. Air Force Museum in Dayton, which is where this jacket is from. This is Jimmy Stewart, the actor's jacket. A lot of people don't know, but he flew 20 missions as a B-24 pilot. And he actually entered the service as a private before the war started. And by the end of the war, he was a full colonel, one of the few people to do that. and he was already a private pilot when he joined, and wanted to fly. And to make a long story short, he was basically marooned, is probably the best way to put it, here in the States, I believe, for a couple of years, because they were afraid to send him overseas, thinking that he might be shot down and killed or captured. But he eventually prevailed on his boss and was assigned to a bomb group that went over to England in '44, and he flew 20 missions. Became a squadron, and then later a group operations officer, was a squadron commander, and then later a group commander. And this jacket, they told me that it was only the second time since 1968 that it had been removed from the display case. So I felt very fortunate to have photographed this jacket. And I should say something else too about museums in general. If you get the chance, go and see these jackets in person. You know, museums are essentially America's closets. And one of the things that I have discovered is that they're almost always understaffed and underfunded, but they do the best they can. And they really have some pretty interesting stuff that brings history to life, so to speak. So this was a friend of mine. This is Bob Punchy Powell. He lived about 6 miles from me before he passed away. He was originally from Bluefield, West Virginia, and flew P-47s and then later P-51s. He said his boss came and told him, he said, "We're getting the new P-51s and you need to go take one up and get familiar with it because we're flying a mission tomorrow." And he said he went up and spent about a half hour with it and came back down, and that was his introduction to the P-51. He did fly on D-Day. He told me that he flew 16 hours over 3 different missions and was so tired at the end of the day that he had to be helped from the cockpit by his crew chief and ground crew because his legs wouldn't support his weight. And he also relayed the story to me. They took off at night before daybreak, and there was one string of lights put across the runway so they could see where they were supposed to go. There was no lighting otherwise for operational security reasons. And after the first flight of 3 took off, the lights were put out. Somebody, you know, somehow it got caught on one of the wheels, I think, and the lights were put out. And so the next group lined up in what they thought was the correct orientation, and actually a 4th aircraft joined in, and there was almost a mid-air collision, if you will, between 2, but one of the aircraft was slightly off alignment and ran into the control tower that was under construction. And immediately the pilot was killed, and there was a big fireball, and the resulting fire allowed all the rest of the fighters to get off the ground without incident. But you know, literally minutes into their operation, they had a casualty. And Punchy actually had a small museum in his basement, and he showed me a melted fragment from that aircraft. It left quite an impression. He's shown here wearing his replica jacket, as his original is in the mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Pooler, Georgia, which is just outside of Savannah. You might wonder why it's there. It's because the 8th Air Force was founded in January of '42 in the National Guard Armory in Savannah. So they thought that was an appropriate place to create the museum. It's a wonderful museum too, by the way. If you get the chance, you should absolutely go. They have wonderful exhibits. They have a B-17 that's been restored on static display there. A chapel that has some wonderful stained glass mementos of the bomb groups and so on. It's just really, really, and they have an extensive library, I should say, too, of books and unit histories and so on that's been used quite a bit by all sorts of people to research books and movies and so on. But Punchy was, as they say, one of the members of the greatest generation, really a Superman. This is Lieutenant Colonel Vincent Masters. He was a B-17 pilot, and then rather than, and he served during D-Day, but because he was also an operations officer, he did not fly that day, but his unit did. He completed 28 missions and finished in July, I believe, of 44. And rather than come back to the States like most people did, he stayed and was instrumental in the founding of the 3rd Scouting Force, which was a secret unit that basically they flew ahead of the bomb groups to the target and assessed it for defenses and weather. And if everything was kosher, they told the bomb groups to come on. And if there was, for any reason, they didn't think it was a good target that day, they told them to go to Plan B. But those guys flew P-51s. And he was the commander of this unit, so he was promoted to lieutenant colonel at 24 years old. And all of the members, all the other pilots in the group had been bomber pilots, so they understood the operations of the bomb groups and what they needed to know, and they transitioned into P-51s. After the war, he became a medical doctor. He attended medical school at Stanford, and he is shown here wearing one of his original uniform shirts and the French Legion of Honor. And he also was just a very special human, and is now buried in Arlington, Virginia, at Arlington National Cemetery, I should say, in Virginia. And that's a picture of his fighter plane, Master's Mistress. And this is him in the center there. I believe they're in England when this image was created. And that's the unit insignia on his jacket there. And the fellow on the right, I believe his name was Al Dentoni, was a good friend of his, and he was killed on a mission over Berlin in mid-44, I believe. And this is his jacket. You'll notice the liner has been replaced and the cuffs and waistband. And it's got some pretty severe wear. And I asked him about that. And he was actually shot down on the 24th. Well, how shall I say this? They were forced down. Their plane, let's see here. So they participated in a mission where they flew across Germany and then came over the Balkans and landed in North Africa. And the plane was pretty bad shape by then. But there was a major on board who insisted that they participate in a bombing mission on France on their way back to England, even though Vince tried to advise him the plane wasn't really in good enough shape to do that, but the major insisted. So they did. And as they left France, several engines crapped out on the plane, and they basically had to ditch in the North Sea / Atlantic. They were actually on the western side of England, and there were 30-foot seas because there was a storm. And there were 11 men in the aircraft, and 4 of them perished, drowned in the 24 hours that they were out there floating around. The British rescue service knew where they were, but they couldn't get to him because it was so rough. And he was back on duty 2 weeks later. But he told me he was wearing this jacket during that ordeal. And I don't know if you can read, it's kind of blurry. The card itself was not well defined, but if you ditched in the ocean or sea or what have you, you qualified for what was ubiquitously called the Goldfish Club, and this was his membership card. And if you bailed out over land, you would also get a card that qualified you as a member of the Caterpillar Club. And that's his unit insignia. So this is the cover of the book. I thought I would put a few pictures in there of the book and so on, just to give you an idea. It's 12 inches by 12 inches. We wanted to make it pretty large scale. And it's 6 pounds. It's 398 pages. And this actually, my graphic designer, who did a marvelous job, he had the idea to put a picture, an illustration of Punchy's aircraft, his P-51, on the inside of the dust jacket. And so when you open it up, it's almost 3 feet wide, but we have a feeling several people are going to frame that. This illustration was contributed by a fellow named John Mollison, who's in South Dakota, I believe. And he's been illustrating aircraft ever since he was a kid. And I got to thinking there's probably a lot of young people, especially these days, that have no idea what a P-51 or a B-17 look like. And so I contacted him and asked him if I could use this picture in particular. And he said no. And I asked him why. And he said, well, the one that I had initially seen, he had painted, illustrated in early 2000s. And he said, I can do it better. So he redid it for me, and that's the one that's used here. And he contributed 6 other images too: B-17, P-38, etc., P-47. And this one here, that's a Stearman on the right-hand side. That was a training aircraft. And this particular one is the aircraft that was flown by B. Haydu, who was a WASP, a Women Air Force Service Pilot. And we have a few portraits of WASPs in the book. And I should mention, they were also issued the A2 jackets, but they were not painted up like the guys in England and some of the combat theaters did. And they're very rare, very hard to come by. When they disbanded in December of '44, they were allowed to keep 1 item of clothing. And most of them kept a blouse or a skirt, and their jackets were pretty much turned back into the Army, to the stores to be reissued. But she actually, so I found one. I was photographing 4 WASPs in 2017, and I asked one of the ladies, I said, by chance, do you have your A2? And she said, yes. And so that one is in the book. And again, and she had an original Fifanella patch. Fifanella was their mascot, so to speak. It was a mascot created by Disney. And she had a patch in an envelope, and I laid it on the jacket and photographed it. But and on the left here, you can see what's called a blood chit, a CHIT, and essentially that's a pass or a ticket. It's a Indian word that the British picked up and used. And initially, these were on the outside of the back of the jackets in the China, Burma, India theater. And essentially it says, I'm an American here, I'm fighting the Japanese, and if you'll render aid, you will be rewarded. But it was in the French language, Thai, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, I believe. And so it could be read across, a wide region. And the number down at the bottom was important, because if you didn't have the number when you turned into your claim that you helped an American, there was no money offered. So the number was important. And I've come to find out that these are still in use today. And the numbers were issued in blocks out to a unit, and then the individual number was issued out to a specific pilot. So if you had the number, you could tell who it belonged to. This is one of the jackets, I believe, from the 390th Memorial Museum in Tucson. And that museum is on the grounds of the Pima Air and Space Museum. And to my mind, I shot 32 jackets there in March of 2018. And to my mind, they had the loveliest collection as far as artwork goes. They just had some really spectacular jackets. And when you open it up in the book, this is probably bigger than life size. These were not big men. These aircraft look like they're pretty good size on the outside, but when you get inside, they were pretty tight. And the fighter pilots especially were generally small framed, just because the cockpits were so tight. And it's kind of hard to see here in this one, but there's actually a bombardier inside the bubble on the nose of the aircraft. And you can see the little flags on the bombs denoted the countries where that particular mission was. This is one of Mollison's illustrations. This is a 390th Bomb Group aircraft, the Square J. And the aircraft were identified by large individual numbers in a field, either a triangle or a square, etc. And so it was easy to see what group and sometimes even squadron that the aircraft belonged to. This is a heartbreaking story here. I had a fella call me out of the blue several years ago. I was driving to an air show in Florida, and it turns out this was his uncle's. He had a compelling story about his uncle who was shot down over the Brenner Pass in February of 1945 and lost his life along with 10 other men on the plane. He was the tail gunner in a B-24, and as they were leaving the target, the aircraft suffered a direct hit in the fuselage right in front of the tail gunner's position, and the tail basically separated from the aircraft at 20,000 feet, and he fell out of the aircraft, and all 11 men perished in the crash. And his brother showed up to the very same unit and walked into his tent either the next day or the day following, looking for his brother. And of course, everybody thought he was a wise guy, and then they set him straight that his brother had been shot down and killed. And so that's how he came to own his brother's jacket. That's the missing aircrew report on the left-hand side there, that basically was filed each time an aircraft went down. Witnesses were asked, did you see any chutes come out? Do you know the location, et cetera, et cetera. And these 50 caliber shell casings on the right-hand side were recovered from the crash site at some time later. So one thing I should mention is that these technically were called A2 summer weight flight jackets, and they were not warm. This is a field jacket, and it had a woolen liner. And so sometimes pilots traded their leather jackets for one of these because it was warmer. And this was the case. This is Warren Swenson's jacket here. He was a Wisconsin native and probably was used to cold weather, I would think. But his son actually lent this jacket to me to be photographed. And so I thought that was an interesting departure from what you might expect. This is Paul Crawford. He's wearing a replica jacket here. He was a P-51 pilot in China and was shot down in July of 1945 on his 29th mission in a brand new P-51. He said he was really ticked off about it because he said it was the best plane he ever flew. He's still alive. He lives here in Atlanta in an assisted living complex. I'm told he's still pretty sharp. He can't hear worth a lick, but the story goes he was shot down while strafing a small railroad complex, and he spent the following 2 weeks walking over 200 miles to escape the Japanese with the help of the communist Chinese, and wound up at the compound of a Chinese businessman who had gone to school in the States and had married an American woman. And a few days later, he and several other pilots were flown out from a nearby airfield back to their units. And he arrived back home to Americus, Georgia, small, tiny town in South Georgia, on Christmas Eve, 1945. That is his original jacket on the left. And as you can see, the liner has been replaced, but the flag was put back in there. And I asked him about the bloodshed. I said, did you have a bloodshed? And he said, yes, but whoever replaced the liner threw away the bloodshed. And I asked him, I said, did you shoot the guy? And he said, I thought about it. But, you know, it's just mind-boggling how a lack of knowledge can really change things, so to speak. But that's his original jacket on the left, and he's wearing a replica on the right-hand side. So a little bit of info about how the jackets were photographed. Basically, I created a light box. It's all white on the inside there. There's a white piece of foam core on the base, so that, you know, if there's blue carpet or gray concrete or whatever's underneath, that doesn't affect the color coming up through. And you see the black thing on the lower right there, that's a softbox. It's a strip light. It's 1 foot high and 4 feet across, and there was one of those on each side, so that when the strobes went off, light went up through the box, through the plexiglass. And the jacket itself was illuminated with the beauty dish on the left and a grid, so that I wanted to show texture in the jackets. I could have lit it with 2 soft boxes, but the soft box is called that because it's very soft light that comes out. It wraps around everything, and basically it fills in cracks and crevices and so on. So there would have been no texture shown per se. And I didn't really want that. I wanted to see texture. So we put the beauty dish across the top, and it bounces into the card at the base of the ladder there. And then the other two cards on each side also catch light coming up from the box underneath. And so it filled in a very nice way. And I think we got basically the best of both worlds. We got some texture and also some soft light. So it worked out quite well. And I would get up on the ladder and shoot down. I wasn't directly over the jackets, but close enough that it looks like it's directly over the jackets. And I would tether the camera to my laptop computer, and the file would come in about 3 seconds, and I could see if the image was sharp, if I needed to change the composition or adjust the jacket, lighting wise and that sort of thing. And we could shoot a jacket front and back and any details in about 10 minutes. And one thing I did also, I didn't want them to be flat per se. So I would put a little bit of bubble wrap inside the torso of the jacket just to give it a little bit of form. And that helped also with reflections and so on. And it worked out pretty well. So we have a website for the book, WWII, bomberboys.com. I thought about doing just Bomber Boys, but then I thought more about it, and I didn't want the FBI showing up on my doorstep on Sunday morning. So we put the WWII in there. And we have a YouTube channel now, too, where some of these fellows were interviewed, either an audio interview or a video interview, and you can read, listen, and learn more about their time in combat and their time in the service. So please, questions.
John, that is absolutely fascinating. It's just to me, it's folk art. It's the kind of thing that definitely needs to be preserved, and your book certainly does a great job of that. I'm glad so many of them are in museums. Glad so many are in private family collections too, because of course family should hang on to these artifacts. But it's just a great bit of history that's being preserved. And we did have a question come in from April, who is the president of the National D-Day Memorial, and she thanks you for the presentation, of course, but also, do you know of any other nations that did something similar with bomber jackets?
I have been asked that question, and from what I can tell, no. This was very much an American thing. And you've seen nose art on aircraft as well, and it I think it's a little bit of bravado, and it's a little bit of machismo, and just a little bit of how should we say it? Just American joie de vivre, that let's paint our airplane and give it a name, and it carried over to the jackets. And as I mentioned early on, the casualty rate was really quite high, and the commanders, technically painting on the jackets was against regulations, but the commanders realized that these guys could literally be gone tomorrow. And so it was tacitly condoned. And as long as it wasn't obscene, it was fine. There was one jacket actually that did create quite a stir that I photographed at the Smithsonian. It was, and on the back it had Murder Inc., INC, Murder Incorporated. And apparently the story goes, this fellow was new in country, and a supply sergeant, I'm sure, came along and said, "Hey, you want a jacket?" They're like, "Yeah, sure." It was already painted on the jacket when he got it. Well, he wore it on several missions and was shot down and bailed out, and was photographed wearing the jacket by a German guard that day. And the photograph wound up on Hitler's desk, and he used it as propaganda, claiming that the Americans were pulling hardened criminals out of jails and prisons and sending them overseas to kill innocent German women and children. And it became a very big PR gaffe for the 8th Air Force in particular and the American government. And the word came down, obviously, to the commanders to pay a little more attention to what was on the jackets. And a German captain didn't speak English very well, but he basically got the point across that you might want to scrape that off of your jacket, which he did that night with his thumbnail. Spent all night scraping it off. And after the war, his son heard the story and painted it back on there. And there was a story done in the local paper in Charlotte, North Carolina, and a curator at the Smithsonian saw it and asked him if he would donate it, and he did, and it's still in their collection. But I know there's also some pictures out there of German pilots wearing captured A2s, status symbol and that sort of thing. But as far as I know, I do not know. I could be wrong, and I haven't been to England yet. We're going in September to the Battle of Britain Air Show. There may have been some artwork on British jackets, but I haven't seen any on any other countries' jackets to speak of.
How about other branches of the American military? Is there anything equivalent? I can think of one possible one.
Yeah, the Navy, they do patches pretty much instead of artwork on their jackets. And they have a nice custom tradition, if you will, where if you go to a unit, you put that patch on there, and then you transfer to another unit, you just keep adding the patches. So their jackets oftentimes have several patches on them. They don't take them off like you would if you're in an Army unit, per se. You basically display the insignia of your current unit. But I don't think the Navy pilots painted on their jackets too much. And I've also heard that the Navy guys didn't put too much in the way of identifying marks on their jackets for security reasons. Because if they were out on a mission and got shot down, the Japanese would know what carrier they came from and that sort of thing. There's that.
I was wondering about Navy
I'm sorry?
Coast Guard sailors decorating their sea bags.
Yes, I did see one of those at the Naval Aviation Museum. Yes. Yeah, I did see that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and apparently those can be quite elaborate as well.
That's another opportunity for some folk art.
Exactly. Yeah. And I have a friend who actually collects what's called trench art from the First World War. They would take empty shell casings, either pistol, rifle, or artillery cases, and craft some pretty incredible artwork out of that as well. But that's a whole nother story.
I've run across a number of people very interested in nose art, and we've got a collection of photos where a pilot, and I think it was the CBI, captured a number of examples. And the nose art also very obviously made by young men who are away from home and away from their girlfriends. But
yeah, exactly.
How often did the nose art get represented on the flight jackets? Was there
correspond to the jackets?
Yeah.
I think fairly often, although I can't say that authoritatively. Because I think, well, let me put it this way. Some of the jackets were painted by crewmen on that particular aircraft. Some were painted by hired guns, if you will. Several Disney artists were drafted into the service, much to their dismay, because they took quite a pay cut, from what I understand, and wound up painting a lot of nose art and so on. But I'm because of, I'm sure, operational tempo and everything else, a lot of times jackets were painted either by crewmen or at the time, you have to remember, sign painting was a profession, much more so than it is today, because, they didn't have electronic signs like we have now. So there were guys who painted jackets who had been professional sign painters, and they actually did some pretty compelling work too. And then in some theaters in Italy, some of the jackets, I'm sure, were painted by local artisans there, as probably in China, Burma, India. Especially in Italy, their economy had been decimated. And on some of the jackets, you'll see the roundels of the 15th Air Force and so on, or unit patches themselves that are layered and incised leather. And local artisans there would create those for a fee, obviously, and have them put on the jackets and so on. So you know, if you've been in the military at all, just virtually any military base you go to, there are industries that spring up just off post. You know, get your uniform altered here, type thing, or you know, buy your beer here, whatever the case may be. And I'm sure that happened during the war. But to answer your question directly, I'm not sure how much it translated from nose art to the jackets. I think it did happen on occasion, but I think sometimes not so much.
And another little bit odd question. In the television show Hogan's Heroes, is Colonel Hogan wearing an A2? Is it Bob Crane? I think was the.
He is actually. That is a famous jacket. That jacket actually was sold, I believe, in the '90s for $22,000.
Wow.
But it also is the same jacket that Frank Sinatra wore in the movie Von Ryan's Express.
Oh, okay.
Same jacket, yeah.
So I don't remember any art on it, but it's been a while since I've seen that.
No, I don't think so, as I recall, other than the, I believe, 8th Air Force patch on the shoulder. But yeah, that's a pretty famous jacket. And I should say also that in my book, I talk about the cultural influence these jackets have. I actually hired a fashion historian to write a section for me on that very subject. And when she turned in her findings, it was 22 pages typewritten. I was shocked. And she said that she's probably found enough information to create her own book on the subject, which I wouldn't be surprised if she does. She's a very prolific writer. And, you know, so there's, and I, you know, when I was crafting the book, I wanted to create a book that I would have liked to have read, you know, so we have examples of the artwork, and we have stories. As much as I could find, we included stories like the story of Punchy and the D-Day crash and all that sort of thing is in there. Paul Crawford's story is in there. The crash over the Brenner Pass is in there. And, you know, the families especially supplied additional artifacts and so on. So I photographed them. So it's more than just hopefully just a pretty picture book of jackets. And it tells the story of their service. But also we have this section on how these jackets influence fashion and culture worldwide, movies especially. You know, Indiana Jones, although that's not an A2, it's a pretty close knockoff. You know, 12 O'Clock High, The Great Escape with Steve McQueen, 12 O'Clock High with Gregory Peck. You know, and then there's a section in there on collecting the jackets. I put the word out through Facebook. I was looking for somebody to speak authoritatively about the jackets. And several people said, contact Jeff Schrader. And I did. I found out that he has his own company that buys and sells militaria called Advanced Guard Militaria. He's in Missouri, but he's also been an appraiser for Antiques Roadshow for the last 10 years plus. And he has a small collection. And he agreed to write a little section for me on collecting the jackets. A lot of it's common sense. You know, don't spend more than you can afford to lose. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. You know, things like that. And, you know, he stressed quality over quantity. Some people just want to have 500 jackets, and they may not be, you know, a wise investment. But if you have, you know, 6, 8, 10 jackets with really exceptional artwork and stories, you've got something there. So he was very kind and gracious in doing that. And I contacted a professional conservator who had done some work for the 390th Museum. And she wrote a little section for me, which we turned into an FAQ, frequently asked questions on how to take care of them. And again, it's a lot of common sense stuff, but you know, don't put them on hangers and leave them, because the weight of the jacket will eventually show up in the shoulders and damage it that way. If you're going to store it, put it in an acid-free archival box. You know, no bugs, obviously. Keep them out of the light, keep them in normal humidity, not too dry, not too damp, you know, things like that. And probably the most important thing she said, and a lot of people will probably disagree with this, but I asked her about leather treatments, and online you'll find all sorts of recommendations about this and that leather treatment to put on them. And she said, that's probably not a good idea. And I asked her why, and she said, because leather treatments are for things that are used daily. shoes, ball gloves, regular gloves, and any sort of leather that you're going to use where the treatment will wear off over time. But she stressed that if you put it on a jacket and then store it, essentially what happens is it begins to attract dust, and then dust starts attracting other things. And she said it essentially could accelerate the deterioration of the jacket. So she recommended not doing that. And that makes perfect sense to me. And she's got a master's degree in the subject, so I think she probably knows what she's talking about. And, she's done work for the Smithsonian and other pretty highly reputable organizations, so I would take her word for it. And then we have an index in the book, too, which there were several books done 20, 25 years ago, but they were not professionally photographed, and I'm not beating people up for that. But they didn't really have any stories about the owners, and they didn't have an index, which I found puzzling. So we think this is going to have some legs as far as research in the future as well. And actually, Auburn University already bought two for their library, one for their permanent collection for research, and one for their general collection that can be checked out and so on. They have an extensive aviation archive down there as well. And actually, the curator at the Smithsonian that I worked with, Dr. Alex Spencer, he got his doctorate at Auburn. Anyway, so we think it's a very handsome book. It's already been nominated for, it's actually won a silver award in an overseas design competition. And it's on the short list right now for the New York Art Directors Club in the publication design category, which they'll announce that on the 17th of May. So who knows? But, my graphic designer just did a marvelous book, and I was thrilled to have the other contributors, put in their parts to the book, which I think makes it a pretty nice whole, so to speak.
Well, excellent. It makes you wonder how many men came home from the war and wore their jackets, through the 40s into the 50s until they're just, tattered rags, and probably just tossed them at that point.
Yeah, that actually happened. I've come to find out. And of course, the one with the scantily clad female there, when you came back from the war, you didn't wear that in Littleville, USA. It just wasn't done, which is why some of them survived. They went into closets and under beds and that sort of thing. And some of the guys, the GI Bill was instituted then, and they wore them to college. Right. And some of them were worn out then. They gave them to their son, and they took them to school, and they disappeared there. I heard stories about some that were, as a result of divorce, thrown into a fire pit. And, so people ask, well, how many are left? And there's no way of telling. Right. My best guess, and it's essentially a guesstimate, is there were about 750,000 produced. They weren't new to World War II. They came out actually in 1931. But during the Great Depression, the military budgets were limited, and there were some years only 500 were produced, and some years there were no records kept as to how many were produced. So, but my best guess from all sources I could gather is about 750,000 were produced.
Wow. Well, it's a fascinating topic and a very beautiful book. Tell us your webpage. So if anyone wants to get more information or buy the book, they can go there.
Yes, please. It's WWII Bomberboys with an S.com. That's the website. There's a link from there to the YouTube channel where you can see some of the interviews and so on. And we're hoping to add to that as well. It's I don't know, a dozen or so right now, but as time goes on, we think we'll be able to add to that. And there's contact information there. If you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to talk, and so on. And we've given several presentations. I've got another one coming up here in May to the docents of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and I'm sure I'll be speaking again at AirVenture this summer in Oshkosh. And I believe I'm going to be speaking at Duxford at the Battle of Britain Air Show in September as well. But please, if you have an interest at all, reach out and contact me, or better yet, buy a book.
Well, John, we want to thank you for your presentations. It's, again, a fascinating topic, and what a great way to preserve kind of little known aspect of World War II history. And certainly invite you on all your travels. If you're ever coming through Virginia, stop by the D-Day Memorial. Love to see you and show you around.
I'd love to. My dad was originally from southwestern Virginia, and it's a place near and dear to my heart, and I'd love to come by and say hi. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I do appreciate it.
Please do. May 11th is our next Lunchbox lecture. We'll also feature an in-person presentation. So if you're in Bedford, come by and see live. It will be Liam O'Connor, the architect for the new British Normandy Memorial in Normandy, and be a great presentation. He was the architect who helped design that. So please come to that or tune in online if you can't get to Bedford. And in the meantime, I'll remind you also, it's a beautiful time of year to come and visit and see the memorial in all its springtime glory. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to many more Lunchbox lectures in the future.